Have you ever wondered how a single monarch's descent into madness could reshape the entire course of the world of history? King George III, known to many as the Mad King, presided over one of the most catastrophic losses in British imperial history, the American Revolution. But the truth behind his reign reveals a far more complex and tragic figure than the villainous tyrant portrayed in popular culture. This is a man whose mental struggles would define not only his own legacy, but the fate of two nations. George III ruled for nearly 60 years, longer than almost any British monarch before him. Yet his reign became synonymous with loss, madness, and the collapse of Britain's first empire. The king, who was supposed to expand British dominion instead, watched helplessly as 13 colonies slipped from his grasp, forever altering the balance of global power. His story is one of duty, delusion, and devastating personal tragedy that would echo through generations. What drove this monarch to such extremes? How did a king raised to embody absolute authority become the symbol of imperial failure? The answers lie not just in politics and war, but in the darkest recesses of a troubled mind that would eventually betray both king and country. This is the true story of George III, the monarch whose madness lost America. George William Frederick was born on June 4, 1738, the eldest son of Frederick, Prince of Wales, and Princess Augusta of Saxe-Gotha. From the moment of his birth, young George carried the weight of dynastic expectations upon his shoulders. His grandfather, George II, ruled the expanding British Empire with an iron fist, and the boy would one day inherit this vast dominion stretching across continents. Tragedy struck early in George's life when his father, Prince Frederick, died suddenly in 1751. The prince was only 12 years old when he became heir to the throne, thrust into a role that would define every aspect of his existence. His mother, Princess Augusta, became the dominant force in his upbringing, instilling in him a rigid sense of duty and an unwavering belief in the divine right of kings. Unlike many royal children who received haphazard educations, George was subjected to an intensive scholarly program. His tutors drilled him relentlessly in languages, mathematics, history, and the art of governance. The young prince displayed a keen intellect and an almost obsessive attention to detail that would later manifest in both his administrative capabilities and his psychological struggles. George's education extended far beyond academics. He was trained in the martial arts befitting a future king, mastering horsemanship and swordsmanship. Contemporary accounts describe him as a tall, robust young man with piercing blue eyes and a commanding presence. Yet beneath this imposing exterior lay a sensitive soul, prone to anxiety and periods of intense melancholy. The prince's relationship with his grandfather, King George II, remained strained throughout his youth. The old king viewed his heir with suspicion, perhaps sensing the stubborn independence that would later define George III's reign. This tension within the royal family would have profound implications for British policy in the years to come. In 1760, at the age of 22, George ascended to the throne following his grandfather's sudden death. The coronation of George III marked the beginning of a new era in British history. Unlike his German-born predecessors, George III was the first Hanoverian monarch born on British soil, and he took great pride in proclaiming himself a true Briton. The new king inherited an empire at the height of its power. British forces had recently achieved stunning victories in the 7 Years' War, crushing French ambitions in North America and India. The Royal Navy dominated the world's oceans, and British merchants grew wealthy from global trade networks that stretched from the Caribbean to the Far East. Yet George III also inherited significant challenges. The war had left Britain drowning in debt, and the American colonies were growing increasingly restless under imperial taxation. The king's ministers advised him that over the increasingly firm action was needed to maintain control defiant colonists who dared to question parliamentary authority. From the earliest days of his reign, George III displayed the characteristics that would define his monarchy: an absolute conviction in royal prerogative, an unwillingness to compromise on matters of principle, and a growing paranoia about threats to his authority. These traits, combined with the mounting pressures of empire, would set the stage for the greatest crisis of his reign. George III approached the growing colonial crisis with a mixture of bewilderment and righteous indignation. To his mind, the American colonists were ungrateful subjects who had forgotten their place within the natural order of the empire. The king genuinely believed that Britain had spent blood and treasure protecting these distant territories from French aggression, and now they refused to pay their fair share of the costs. The Stamp Act of 1765 marked the beginning of the king's confrontation with colonial resistance. When news reached London of violent protests and the burning of tax collectors in effigy, George III was appalled. How dare these subjects defy the will of Parliament and, by extension, the Crown itself? The king's advisers assured him that a firm hand would quickly restore order to the rebellious provinces. But the colonists proved far more defiant than anyone in London had anticipated. The Boston Tea Party of 1773 sent shockwaves through the royal court. George III viewed this act of destruction as nothing short of treason, a direct assault upon the very foundations of imperial authority. His response was swift and merciless. The intolerable acts closed Boston Harbor and stripped Massachusetts of its colonial charter. Contemporary accounts describe the king during this period as increasingly agitated and prone to explosive outbursts. Palace servants whispered of late-night pacing in the royal chambers, of the monarch muttering angrily to himself about colonial ingratitude. The stress of governing a sprawling empire was beginning to take its toll on George III's fragile mental state. The situation deteriorated rapidly when shots were fired at Lexington and Concord in April 1775. What had begun as a tax dispute had escalated into open warfare. George III declared the colonies to be in a state of rebellion, authorizing military force to crush what he still believed would be a brief uprising. The king was convinced that a few decisive battles would bring the wayward colonists back into the imperial fold. The appointment of military commanders became a source of constant frustration for the monarch. General after general promised quick victory, only to return with excuses and requests for more troops. George III grew increasingly suspicious of his own military hierarchy, convinced that incompetence or even treachery was undermining his efforts to restore order. As the war dragged on, the king's behaviour became more erratic. He would spend hours poring over maps of North America, moving toy soldiers across the Atlantic colonies as if he could personally direct every skirmish from his palace chambers. Ministers reported that the king frequently interrupted cabinet meetings with rambling monologues about colonial defiance and the need to maintain imperial dignity. The entry of France into the conflict in 1778 transformed George III's colonial rebellion into a global war that threatened the very survival of the British Empire. The king's worst nightmare had come to pass. Britain now faced her traditional enemy across multiple theatres while simultaneously battling insurgents in America. The strain of coordinating this massive military effort pushed the monarch to the brink of mental collapse. Palace physicians began to notice disturbing changes in the king's behaviour. His speech became rapid and disjointed, jumping from topic to topic without logical connection. He complained of severe headaches and periods of confusion that left him unable to recognise familiar faces. The royal family tried to conceal these episodes from the public, but whispers of the king's declining health began to spread throughout London. The decisive defeat at Yorktown in 1781 shattered George III's remaining hopes of retaining the American colonies. When news of Cornwallis's surrender reached the palace, witnesses described the king as falling into a cataleptic state, staring blankly ahead for hours without speaking. The loss of America represented not just a military defeat, but a complete collapse of everything George III believed about royal authority and imperial destiny. The defeat at Yorktown marked more than just the end of British rule in America. It signalled the beginning of George III's final descent into the madness that would define his legacy. The king, who had once proclaimed himself the father of his people, became a tragic figure, confined to the shadows of his own palace as his mind betrayed him completely. His periodic episodes of insanity grew longer and more severe, leaving Britain under the regency of his son while he raved about conversations with dead ministers and imaginary military victories. George III's story serves as a haunting reminder of how personal demons can alter the course of nations. His unwavering belief in absolute authority, combined with a mind gradually consumed by illness, cost Britain its most precious colonial jewel and gave birth to a new republic that would one day surpass the empire that created it. The Mad King's legacy lives on not in the territories he lost, but in the profound lesson that even the most powerful rulers are ultimately human, vulnerable to the same frailties that plague us all. In losing America, George III inadvertently helped create the modern world. His madness became the catalyst for American independence, proving that tyranny, no matter how divinely ordained, cannot endure forever against the will of free people.